So, good morning to all. My name is Sister Martha de la Torre from Sisters of Mary Reparatrix and a staff member of Strangers No Longer, working to build circle of support among immigrant women. On behalf of the Accompaniment Task Force of Strangers No Longer, together with Alianza Americas, we welcome you to this workshop on immigration policy issues as we move into the Biden administration. This workshop will end on time at 11:15. And we are recording this workshop, and this event will be available in our website, is strangersnolonger.com. So you can .org. So we are beginning now, and with Amy Kedner, who will guide us through a reading of a part of an article written by Daniel G. Grudy, and it is entitled Jesus and the Undocumented Immigrant, a Spiritual Geography of a Crucified People. Amy, please.
So I'll share your presentation, Amy.
Please, thank you. The reality of the journey of the immigrant today can be interpreted precisely as a way of the cross. In the process of leaving Mexico, crossing the border, and entering the United States, undocumented Mexican immigrants experience nothing short of a walk across a border of death. Even when they do not die physically, they undergo a death culturally, psychologically, socially, and emotionally. Their journey involves an economic sentencing, whereby they have to shoulder the difficult responsibilities of leaving family, home, and culture for an unknown future in the United States, and the search for a job with meager wages. The Mexican immigrant experiences an agonizing movement from belonging to non-belonging, from relational connectedness to family separation, from being to non-being, from life to death. Economically, undocumented Mexican immigrants experience a movement from poverty in Mexico to poverty and exploitation in the United States. Politically, they experience oppression. Legally, they are accused of trespassing. Socially, they feel marginalized. Psychologically, they undergo intense loneliness. And spiritually, they experience the agony of separation and displacement. The suffering of the immigrant points not only to the reality of their personal struggles, but also to the socioeconomic conditions that contribute to this suffering. So, this talks a little bit to the plight of the journey, right, to get here, and of the community members that we work with once they are here in our communities. Martha talked about she mentioned the Accompaniment Task Force, and there are several of us here on this call that are part of the Strangers No Longer Accompaniment Task Force. And we're people who are on the ground, if you will, and in communities of undocumented peoples from Mexico, but also from a variety of countries. And we walk with them once they are here and journey with them in all of the ups and downs that life here brings them, life in the shadows. And we provide emotional and spiritual support, as well as helping them to look for resources and rides and pastoral care and variety of things. And so I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to do that and to journey with my other friends and partners on the accompaniment task force. And here today, our invitation to you all is to hear more about how we can continue to work to in the ways that we're able to take Christ down from the cross in the cross of our neighbors. So, Marta?
Thank you very much, Amy. So now we are going to ask Bill O'Brien, our Executive Director of Strangers No Longer, if he can introduce our presenter. Please, Bill.
You're on mute, Bill.
Okay. Unmute, Bill. You're mute.
You're muted, Bill.
I think he can't unmute himself.
We're working on it here.
There we go.
There we go.
There are too many people. There were, we got 41 people. I couldn't find myself. We thought this morning, Sister Martha, we thought we had Anderson Cooper or Joy Reid here to facilitate, but so anyway, I stood in for them. So we have, we're privileged this morning. Rich, if you could show that next slide. Strangers No Longer has become associated with and actually a member of Alianza Americas. Now, Alianza Americas is a transnational, means they have in several different countries. It's a transnational network of organizations that are founded by, led by immigrants themselves. So we are very privileged to be in that relationship. Alianza Americas, read it as the mission is to achieve a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable way of life for Latino immigrant communities living in the United States and throughout the Americas. So Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, now Nicaragua. And by working transnationally with community leaders and government agencies, labor organizers, religious communities, we work to create a more dignified and just way of life for all people living in the Americas. So we're very happy, Rich, to have, next slide, to have with us here Moni Ruiz Velasco. Moni is the Associate Director at Alianza for Power Building, and she comes to Alianza after 20 years of organizing and legal work on immigrant rights and social justice. She is a lawyer. She was the Executive Director for 5 years of PASO, in the western suburbs of Chicago. She was the legal director at the NIJC. Many of you may know that group, the National Immigrant Justice Center. She was board chair of a very large and powerful coalition statewide in Illinois. And then she got her law degree at St. Mary's University Law School in San Antonio. She grew up both in Mexico and South Texas. She has 3 children. And Moni, it's wonderful having you. We've been looking forward to an opportunity like this to have you. And thankfully, we had an inauguration and we have a new administration. So Rich, let's turn it over to Moni. So Moni Ruiz Velasco. Thank you, Moni.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. This is actually some of my favorite things. All of my work I do, this is one of my favorite things to do, is to come into these spaces and share, and kind of we all learn from each other, I think, through these conversations. So just a little bit, I mean, Bill explained a lot about my background. I'm newer to the Alianza Americas team. I joined last year after many years of relationship with them, because we all work together collaboratively in this small but ever growing and powerful immigrant rights and immigrant justice spaces. So I've known Oscar for many years, for more than 20 years, I think now. And yeah, like I said, I'm happy to be part of this team now and kind of expand the work into looking at things not only from the US perspective, but also from the perspectives of Mexico and Central America and countries where Alianza Americas works. Like Bill said, I grew up in, just so you know a little bit about me, I grew up both in South Texas and in Mexico, mostly in Mexico when I was little. My parents are Mexican immigrants. They were undocumented for a while. They're both citizens now, but it took a long time for them to get there. And I went to mostly high school and then up to college and then law school in Texas, and then eventually moved to Chicago in the year 2000, and have been in Chicago pretty much ever since. So, and my life's work has been immigration since I was in law school, and actually a little bit before, working with immigrant communities. And primarily my focus has been working with more vulnerable communities. I started doing my work with domestic violence survivors, in particular Mexican women who were domestic violence survivors, and it kind of grew from there, and working with many other communities. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I can make this happen.
Moni, while you're
yes.
getting set up there, we are going to be monitoring the chat box. So Moni will give her presentation, but anytime you have a question, please pop it in the chat box, and we'll keep track, and we'll let Moni know what the questions are. Moni?
Great. Let me just, hold on, give me 1 second. I'm going to share my screen so we can start about PowerPoint. Although I think as I kind of get this organized, one of the things I really hope that we can do today is make sure that this is the space where you can not only have questions answered, but what they becomes like a rich space for all of us to to discuss and share, and especially in this new moment of new hope.
I think you're muted now, Moni. You got muted.
Let me see.
There you are.
I'm here. Okay. Let me see. I don't know why it's not letting me share.
We're not seeing you yet. Your share yet.
Yeah, I know. It's saying something weird. Let me see. I'm sorry. Let me just try this again. And if not, maybe I can email you my presentation and you guys can share it for me.
Certainly.
Is that easier?
Yeah, if you can't do it, I can certainly do that.
Okay, let me just do that now so we don't waste any more time with this.
Not a problem.
Okay, Bill, I'm sending it to you. Let's see if you can make sure it gets to.
Yeah, Bill, why don't you just send it to me then?
Okay, did you get that? Okay, and I'm gonna just get started. Bill already told you about Alianza Americas, and so I can skip over that. Our team is based all over the U.S., so we are, have been virtual even before COVID started, and we're excited to work with all of our partners. We're a network of more than 50 organizations across the U.S. and have a lot of also partner organizations in Mexico and Central America. So we really want to focus on and want to make sure that all of those voices are elevated and included in all of the work that we're doing, and all of the conversations that we're having. So I wanted to start, and as you guys get my PowerPoint up, with just some basic terms so that we're kind of on the same page as we talk about all these different things that we're going to talk about, since it's going to get a little bit wonky, and I just want to make sure that we all understand kind of different things, and I don't want to make any assumptions. So first I wanted to talk about the fact that there are people living in the US with many different immigration statuses. So there are people who are US citizens. So sometimes people were born here and you become a US citizen by law. That's what the Constitution says. But you also can become a US citizen through different processes, whether it's through an immigration process. Sometimes maybe if you're a child of a US citizen and there's certain requirements that are met, then you become a U.S. citizen at birth, even if you're not born here. Then there's people who have what we normally, or people known as green cards, and those are lawful permanent residents. And that's a legal status that allows people to live in the U.S. indefinitely in that status. You don't have to become a citizen if you don't want to, but it is something that comes with more protections, legal protections and rights. So if you have a green card or are a lawful permanent resident, then you can also have, you can't vote, so that's one of the limitations, but you can live here, you can work, you can travel, but you can lose that status. So there are, especially as we saw many harsh immigration laws, that oftentimes we saw people who had been lawful permanent residents for sometimes 20 or 30 years, and for a variety of reasons would be put into deportation proceedings and could lose their status. So it's not.
Hey, Moni, can I stop you for a quick second?
Sure.
I'm unable, I don't have access to your Google Drive. I tried to click on it, so it's not giving me
Okay.
access. I actually requested access to you. If you can grant me that, I don't know if you're seeing it on your email or.
Yeah, I'll double check right now.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Well, let me see. It's not popping up
It's technology.
in my email. I know. I apologize for this.
That's okay.
Let's see. You know what? Let me see if I can download it and share it with you that way. Because it's not popping up as.
Yeah, you
like a
should be able to
request for
share it
access.
yourself. I mean, you are a host, so I'm surprised
Yeah.
you can't share it.
Let me
but
try again.
yeah, you should be able to just go to share, and you should see your web browser as one of the share options, and you go in there and click on the one for your Google Drive.
Yeah, yeah. No, and usually it's you know, here, let me just see what it's doing over here. Okay.
While you're working on that, we have an attorney with the Michigan Immigrants' Rights Center, Catherine Villanueva, from all the way over in Grand Rapids. Catherine, we can wave and say hello here. We also have, hi Catherine. We also have from Port Huron, we've got some of the leaders from Port Huron's Holy Trinity Church, and Charlie Tazius came in from Nativity on the Lower East Side of Detroit. I think our furthest member here is Father Joe Mulligan. Father Mulligan in Nicaragua, Managua, if you want to wave, there he is. We also have Gail Presby, who is from the University of Detroit Mercy and actually teaches a lot of this Latin American history. We have people from around, Eileen Heasley from Christ Our Light in Troy, and her buddy, I think Julie Tenbush is out there with Queso Faro and Eileen. So how's it going there, Moni?
You know what? It's not letting me share because it's saying I need to get out of Zoom and back into Zoom for some weird reason if I want to share. So I'm not sure. If you want me to get out and get back in, I can certainly do that. I feel really bad because I feel like it's cutting into our time, but.
And there's no way for you to download it and to mail it to me?
Yeah, I don't know why it's not letting me do that either. Let me see. I'm just having all kinds of challenge. You know, I think it's because it's a new computer and I may not have shared my screen before with this new computer. Let me see.
If you want to try logging off and logging on, you could do that. I'm a little confused why it's asking you that, but
yeah, let me do that and I can come right back.
Well, we'll have Bill do a song and dance while you're.
No,
okay, that sounds good.
He's very good at that.
Here's what I'd like to do is, Catherine's an immigration lawyer from the west side of the state. Catherine, you say you have a little bit of optimism. Do you want to, just from the point of view of an immigrant lawyer, what are you experiencing over there the last couple of days or weeks? Catherine?
Yeah, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, so I do similar work. I work with domestic violence victims. I have a lot of undocumented clients who are waiting on status. They're waiting on something called a U visa, which has slowed down substantially. These are for victims of crime, so they're waiting, you know, sometimes I think now the wait list is 60 years for them to get status. I've had clients who have been here for 20, 30 years without any kind of status. They have their whole lives here. I have clients who, for the most part, I would refer to them as like undocumented Americans. I had a green card interview yesterday with somebody who had been here since he was 1 year old, and he's 33. And I believe he will be approved. We had a very good interview. But I've been getting a lot of messages where people are cautiously optimistic. This has been decades where people are waiting for some sort of comprehensive immigration reform to address the needs of millions of people who are parts of our community and have been suffering for so long. But again, they've been burned before. So, they're very happy about these executive orders with the moratorium on deportations and the reinstatement of DACA. But they're really waiting for legislative action to give these people some sort of status. And these are people who have children who are here. I have another client. She has been detained during the entire Trump administration. She's been in jail for immigration detention for 4 years, over a 30-day misdemeanor. So we're really hoping to get some sort of relief for people like this who have been suffering.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks. I think we have Moni back here. Thank you, Catherine.
Yes.
And we'll meet you in person someday. Moni?
Thank you. And can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Perfect.
Good
Okay.
job,
Well,
Moni.
I apologize for that delay.
That's all right.
Okay, so we were just talking about basic terms, just to make sure we're all on the same page as we talk about all of these different, orders and things that we're going to talk about. We also have people in the U.S. who are refugees or asylees, and so those are people who came to the U.S. either seeking protection and got the protection, and that's asylees, or people who obtained refugee status outside the U.S. and then came in that way. Obviously, we know, and many of you may know, that especially in these last 4 years, the number of refugees was significantly reduced. So there's very few refugees that have come in the last 4 years, and that's one of the things we're hopeful is going to be changing over this next time, in the next few years. So we also have people in these statuses that sometimes are in that status for a very, very long time, that are victims of a crime, survivors of either violent crimes for U visa, sometimes domestic violence, sometimes other kinds of crimes. People who have T visas are people who have who are survivors of trafficking and are able to apply for this protection. And that's another kind of status that is kind of a quasi, it leads to permanent status, but in that moment, it's not necessarily a permanent status, but it still gives people protection and more stability and ability to work and have a social security number, driver's license, things like that. We have people here who have student visas or employment-based kind of status. So that's like companies who petition for folks to come to the US. And then we have people who have deferred action or DACA. And that is not a status, even though we kind of treat it as one, but it's really just people who have deferred action or DACA are people who have the government has made a decision that they are not a priority for deportation. And in the interim, they're going to give them a work permit, basically an ability to work here legally and have a certain level of protection from deportation, but they're not kind of permanently protected from deportation. And like I said, it's not a permanent status. And then we have folks who are undocumented. We always, and even our campaigns talk about nearly 11 million or around 11 million people in the US who are undocumented. And that means people who either entered with a visa and their status expired, or people who entered without any documentation to begin with. And we have the majority of our undocumented population in the US has been here for decades now. Obviously that's the most vulnerable of the groups and the most targeted oftentimes by government action. So that's, I just want to make sure we have kind of that common language so that everyone kind of understands what we're talking about. And I'm not going to go into this because we could talk about each one of these things for like hours and hours, but I just want to make sure people understand generally how people immigrate to the US, because it's not as simple as sometimes people think. And I know oftentimes when I do a lot of these presentations, people ask me like, well, you know, my grandparents or my great grandparents came and then they were able to get papers, you know, why aren't other people able to get papers now? And I think that's one of the most common types of questions I often get in doing some of these community presentations. But it really is a really complicated process that has become more difficult over the years. And I think it's important to recognize, and we're going to talk a little bit about kind of where we came from in order to get to where we are now. But people have to have some sort of basis or reason to immigrate, some petitioner or some kind of visa. So through family-based, which is a lot of the, you know, folks that we often see and talk about, they may have a spouse or maybe an adult child who's over 21 who can petition for them, or a sibling. But I think I missed part of what, and I'm sorry I didn't catch her name, but what she was saying earlier, some people are waiting sometimes for 20 or 30 years in between the steps that have to be taken in order to get status through family-based petitions. And so that creates obviously really difficult hardships. People, you know, there's a lot of family separation along the way. And even though we have this inspirational idea that our immigration laws are, you know, to promote family unity and things like that, they often don't, and they're actually do the exact opposite. There's also folks who immigrate through protection-based remedies that exist under the law. So there's, you know, like I talked about, U&T visas for crime survivors. VAWA is a Violence Against Women Act. So some folks who are domestic violence survivors and are married to a US citizen or a permanent resident may be able to access some of those protections. And then there's asylum and refugee law that allows some folks to get a certain level of protection. Then we have employment-based visas, which is, like I said, you know, usually through an employer who petitions for an employee, or in some cases, folks can start a business in certain areas and they may be able to get status through that. We have another category of visas that is called a diversity visa, and that's a really small group of people too who can immigrate. And that was designed so that we basically could have diversity in the immigrants that are coming from the US. It was really designed to help get more white immigrants to come to the US. And so there's another category. And then we have students, and we have, you know, periodically other folks who have other kind of status. Now that doesn't mean they can migrate permanently, but it may give them a certain protection to be here for a while for a specific purpose. And the reason I mention all of these things is because all of these categories were on fire, maybe I would say that, under attack in the last 4 years. So it wasn't just one or the other, it literally was every single one of these categories that was, that has been harmed really, and it's going to take a while to rebuild even some of the infrastructure that was destroyed in the last 4 years of the Trump administration, and before that. So, all right, so let's see. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about how we got here, you know, and I think it's important to remember kind of the, you know, and again, I'm just going to take a few minutes to go through this, but I think it's important to remember kind of the context that our immigration laws developed under. I think it's important to know that our whole history of immigration law has really been based on exclusion, on excluding certain groups of people that we didn't want in the country at one period or another. From the very first law, which is the Chinese Exclusion Act, that really, you know, sought to exclude folks who were from China, who had been brought to the US to build railroads. And then at some point they decided we have too many people from China and we don't want them here anymore. And so we should pass a law that prohibits them from becoming citizens, to everything that has happened since, pretty much. So most immigration laws have, even though we tend to talk about them in a different way, the reality is that they have found ways to exclude certain categories of folks who we didn't want. But more recently, which isn't that recent anymore, but in 1996, there was a law that passed, a couple of laws that passed that really, I think, put us in the place where we are today and created a lot of the problems that we're facing today with our immigration laws. And those laws were passed and signed into law by President Bill Clinton back then. And they really kind of turned immigration law. It was like an immigration reform, but on its head. So it really turned immigration law on its head and changed very significantly the way we approached immigration. It created very significant barriers for people to have access to permanent status. So even in the family categories, for example, it created a lot more obstacles for people to be able to get to permanent status, even if they otherwise qualified. It limited asylum protections. It created this concept of what's called mandatory detention, which means some people must be detained, and it's mandatory and they're not eligible for bonds. It criminalized immigration in a way that we hadn't seen before 96, so that then just the act of immigrating could be prosecuted as a crime. And then it limited judges' powers and discretion, so that there were things that judges could do before 96 that they said you no longer have the ability or the discretion to do that, and it really limited the scope of what they could review. And that really, if you think about laws before 96 and the kind of the context of the country before 96, we didn't have like dreamers, as we call them now, before 96, because there was a way for them to potentially get status through the law if they ended up in front of a judge and could apply for something, right? There were a lot of the issues that we're seeing today. The number of undocumented folks wasn't the same. Obviously, even though there was an increase in migration, but there was also an increase in migration partnered with a decrease in the way that people could get access to legal status. And so it created this situation that we're in today. And then when you have all of that, and then on top of that, you have the 9/11 that really put immigration and started having us look at immigration policy through the lens of terrorism, so that it wasn't only criminalized already before, but now it's also an additional layer of thinking of immigrants as terrorists. That became the national rhetoric, and became the way that we treated folks in the US. So, at that time, we saw people being arrested and tried on like secret evidence. So they would say like, your client is deportable and we can't tell you why, and you can't look at any of this. And, how do you defend a case like that, right? We had people disappeared like after 9/11, especially people, from Muslim communities. They literally would disappear and we didn't know where they were. They had been taken by the FBI or Homeland Security. And it was the creation of Homeland Security, which is obviously this like ginormous agency that hosts, all of the immigration agencies within it. And so that created, again, it's like the additional layer on top of everything else that we already had. And then with that, and since then, we have seen pretty much limitless budgets for immigration detention, increasing ICE collaboration with local law enforcement. There was a program that started under the Obama administration called Secure Communities that actually has made our communities much less safe than ever. And then there was the privatization of detention, right? So that private companies are benefiting from the incarceration of human beings. And the incentives behind that are obviously disturbing and huge. And so just to give you a sense of immigration enforcement and detention, this is the fiscal 2019 budget, but there were about 50,000 people in detention on average on any given day. And this is, just so we're clear, this is civil immigration detention, which looks just like criminal detention. It looks the same, but we call it detention versus incarceration. That's the cost that I put up here to detain someone. The detention budget was $3.2 billion. And the majority of that, 81% of all those folks detained were detained in private prisons. So what that means is that money is going into the pockets of corporations and the people who own those. And obviously it was a huge incentive as those corporations became very powerful and powerful lobbyists for an increase in detention. We used to have, that was eliminated a couple of years ago, but we used to have bed quotas so that immigration was mandated to have a certain number of people in detention. But that was something that was eliminated, like I said, just a couple of years ago. And obviously with detention and incarceration comes a lot of other harm, right? And I think I wanted to note that in the last year, there was a 500% increase in the deaths of detention. And obviously in the context of a pandemic, and people being incarcerated, it has become even more and more dangerous than any other statistic. But you can see obviously the sharp increase in the budget and the amount of resources that we spend from our tax dollars on immigration enforcement and detention. If you start, and this one only starts in 2003, so it already starts with the Department of Homeland Security. Oh, we should sit on that for a minute. Okay, so we have all of that formula for really harsh and terrible, unwelcoming situation. And then we have the Trump years. And I decided I only have one slide on the Trump years because I think for many of us who've been in this field for the last 4 years, it has been just the trauma that has come with only even simply working in this field, much more, of course, for people who are directly impacted by these policies. And so I think that, you know, it's important to know what happened and to know what we're facing and in the aftermath of that. But so I just wanted to highlight some of the things. But what I would tell you is that there were over 600 different policy and regulatory changes just in the field of immigration alone that happened under the Trump administration. And none of them were good. So, and it's a huge uphill battle, I think, over these next few years to start to undo some of that harm. And obviously we don't want just the harm undone. We want good things too, right? We don't want it just to go back to the way it was, because the way it was is that under the Obama administration, you know, almost 3 million people and 3 million families were separated and deported. And in addition to an increasing criminalization of immigrants, and really setting up a lot of what became the Trump policies. You know, a lot of the Obama policies kind of gave them that base to grow and to expand. So, but, you know, some of the things that were really, and, you know, I think for again, another thing is that these things happened almost, I mean, it was almost every day, if not multiple times a day, when we were getting alerts of like, okay, now this, and now they're doing this, and now they're changing this. And so it was really kind of a battering of all of the folks in these spaces, obviously of immigrant communities. And it's going to take a long time. And some of the harm is not going to ever be undone, as we've seen with the trauma and the family separation and the children. And, you know, some of those kids are never going to be able to find their parents. And I think that's the reality that we're facing. But under the Trump years, we saw everybody became a priority for deportation. So what had been kind of a prioritization before on things that we didn't like necessarily, but I think that, you know, there was a level of prioritization of who was going to be targeted for deportation. And I think that's, again, with the understanding that, you know, immigrants are a part of our communities, they're an essential part of our communities, and that, you know, making everyone a target for deportation created a lot of fear, a lot of trauma, and yeah, I mean, and you know, it's what we're seeing today. There was family separation that, like I said, began under the Obama years when they created the concept of a family detention center so that they could detain entire families together. That still exists today, but it was really perfected and kind of amplified by the Trump years. You know, they took away even more power of the judges and their discretion. Immigration judges are judges that work for the Department of Justice. They're not independent judges like other federal judges are. And so the Attorney General is their boss, basically. So if we have an Attorney General who limits, you know, what they can do or what they can't do, and can actually take up cases and change the law on their own and things like that. And we saw a lot of that under the Trump years. You know, we saw them creating additional barriers for people based on their income and their disability or their vulnerabilities in a rule that's called a public charge rule. You may have heard about it. We did campaigns about that, I know. They ended DACA and TPS protections. You know, they undermined everything. All of the benefits giving side of immigration was underfunded and really suppressed. So So a lot of those infrastructures are going to have to be rebuilt before they can really start doing good, better things, because they've really decimated a lot of the agencies and the structures that existed within those agencies. They increased the criminalization, they increased harsher enforcement practices, and even before, you know, we saw them separating nursing babies from their mothers. We saw them obviously with the kids in the cages, the arrests in courthouses and hospitals, in churches. I mean, we just saw all kinds of things that I think many of us never thought we would see. The migrant protection protocols, or the Remain in Mexico policies that have harmed, you know, thousands of people who were seeking asylum in the US, you know, were put into place to really limit asylum. And what I would say is that as well as agreements that they did with Central American countries, as well as all of the rules that they've changed around the asylum system, have really, really limited asylum protections in the US today. And again, those things, some of them came through just executive orders like we saw before. Some of them came through regulatory changes or regulations of the government that are going to take more time to undo. Some people are saying some of them could take up to a year or even longer to undo, because there has to be a process. And I think what's really remarkable is none of these changes came through law. So none of them came through a bill or Congress changing anything. The only thing I would say that did come through Congress is the increasing of the detention budget, because the money part comes from Congress. But all of the other policy changes were all administrative changes, that they really understood the power of the presidency, and they really had people in there as you know, crazy things that we heard from the White House. They had people in there who really understood immigration law and policy, and were really able to make it, to turn it as a sword, basically, against immigrant communities and use it in a really bad way. And obviously, another thing that is, you know, kind of on top of it all is the demonizing of immigrant communities, the terrorizing of the communities, you know, and I think that we really all have a part to play in that, in changing how we talk about our immigrant communities, who the immigrant communities are, not just as like we often like to focus on people who deserve and people who don't deserve, but just there's a basic inherent worth of every human being, and you know, the ability for people to live and thrive no matter where they live and who they are, right? So I think that's a part where we all really have to work on that part to change that rhetoric. Okay, so now we can come to a better place. I'm so glad to do this presentation after Wednesday, because these presentations were really tough in the last 4 years. But where we are. So DACA, as you know, is a protection that was given to young people in the last 4 years of the Obama administration. And it's, like I said, it's not status, but it is a temporary protection, and that's in litigation because they tried to end it. So luckily we had a lot of really smart litigators who came in and started fighting a lot of these changes that they tried to do, as well as massive organizing efforts across communities across the country. And DACA is in litigation now. The new president, Biden, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm actually going to send you, one of the things I want to send you via email so everybody has it, is a fact sheet on all of the things that have been announced and all of the things that have happened, and it makes it easier to read because it's a lot. But DACA's in litigation, so we're still waiting. There's a case in the Fifth Circuit, which is, well, it's a case, yeah, in Texas, who there's still a decision pending from that judge about whether the president has the ability to create a program of that kind. And this is a case that has been pending for a long time. That decision could come at any point. The last argument was heard in that case at the end of December. So there's still a possibility that this judge who has, this is the same judge that stopped a different Obama program that would give some temporary protection to parents of US citizens, called DAPA. And that program never went into effect because this judge stopped it from going into effect. So the same exact judge has the DACA case. and we're waiting for a decision on that case. You know, unfortunately, the Supreme Court is not in a place where we feel that their decisions will come out in favor of immigrant communities. And so there's, yeah, so we're really relying on the White House and on Congress now to try to change things, because if these things go up all the way, there probably won't be great for us. TPS is temporary protected status, which is a status that folks have from certain countries where, and I'm sure, you know, if you've been doing work with Bill knows a lot about this, because we've been working, this is one of the main topics of, or areas of work that Alianza Americas does, and it's around temporary protected status for folks who came from countries where there may have been a natural disaster or something like that, that would have prevented them from going back. And that is also in litigation, and that protection is set to end in October of this year for, it's around more than 200,000 folks who live in this country. There's a rule that's called the public charge rule, and that was the rule I was talking about that made it, that really targeted folks who are, you know, more vulnerable, who are either really young or really old, who are more low income, who it prevents certain people from immigrating into the US. And that was a change in the Trump administration that made it more difficult for them. And that is something that really is getting in the way of people accessing legal status that they are eligible for, but for this. MPP, which is a Remain in Mexico, was ended by the first day of the Biden administration, but we're still waiting for information on how they're going to process all of the folks who are outside the country, who are waiting to come in. So what they said is we will no longer put anyone into that program, but you know, there are still thousands of people living in horrid, dangerous conditions in the US-Mexico border who are asylum seekers who have not been given an opportunity to apply for protection. There are, like I said, a lot of asylum rules that really limited the ability for people to apply for asylum, and some of them will take a long time to undo. Some of them will take less time to undo, but I know that that is a priority of the administration, and they're working on that, as well as the community groups that are working to ensure those that there is protection under asylum law, as asylum law was contemplated.
Moni,
Yes.
just a number of us are connected to families that are applying for asylum because they were afraid that their ex spouse would kill them if they came home, or
Yes.
violence, gangs, drug dealers doing the same thing. So I suppose that's some of those things that'll take some time to undo.
Yes, because some of those rules that limited folks in those categories to apply for asylum came from decisions that the Attorney General himself took up and decided to change. And so there is a process that has to happen, like a new case has to go up for them to be able to change some of that. So it is going to take time for some of that to get undone. But those are things that are being actively kind of flagged for the new administration, and that they're aware of, and that there will, I mean, my understanding is that they are, you know, actively working on this. And, you know, and then the immigration courts too, we have backlogs of, you know, sometimes people wait 3 or 4 or 5 years to get a hearing on your case. And, you know, there were also a lot of Trump appointee judges that were put into these immigration judge positions. And it's, you know, again, like, some harm is never going to be able to be undone. There's, you know, people who've been deported, people whose families have suffered a lot, you know, children who have been separated. That kind of stuff is never going, there's no way to fix it. And there's nothing really that we can do to undo it. But there are going to be active steps taken to change some of that. So that's, you know, a little bit about where we are. So I'm just going to go through quickly, and like I said, I'm going to send you a more comprehensive kind of explanation of each of these, but this is what has come out in just this first few days. So on the first day, they put a 100-day pause on deportation so that they could review all of the systems and the policies that exist. There's already been a lawsuit filed in Texas about this memo. that is now, like I said, in litigation again, but there is a 100-day pause that started yesterday. And that was a big win. A lot of our community organizations have been asking for that for a long, long time. So the fact that they follow through on this policy is a big deal. There are new priorities for detention and, oops, there's a typo, deportation. And basically, you know, like I mentioned before, under the Trump administration, he issued a memo or an executive order saying that everyone was a priority, undoing kind of all the prioritization that had happened in many, you know, by many, in many different administrations before. And so this new administration now came in and rescinded the Trump order, so said no to that Trump order, and created their own priorities that are temporary right now until, again, they review everything and come up with their more permanent priorities. But it basically says that unless somebody is involved in terrorism and espionage, came to the US after January 1st of 2020, or the director, so at the highest level, the case is reviewed and they're required by law, then a person should not be detained or deported unless they fit into those categories. It's very great. And I think that we've already started seeing some people released from detention. Not everywhere, but, you know, and it's, again, this is where it's really important to have advocates and folks watching these kinds of situations to make sure that they're followed, because sometimes just because we get an order from the highest level doesn't mean that each individual local office is going to do the right thing and follow it.
So this means that somebody stopped for a traffic or for a tail light who's stuck in detention now could be released.
Yes, that's exactly what that means. That they should be released. Not that they could be, that they should be. It ends MPP, like I said, so that's the remain in Mexico policy.
While we're on that, Moni, Teresa McGuire, go ahead and ask your question, Teresa, if you can unmute yourself. Teresa?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just had the question. I don't understand the it says 11/1, but you said it was January 1, 2020. Is that just some arbitrary date, or is there some reason why it's?
Yeah, it is an arbitrary, it's November 1st.
Okay.
Yeah, November 1st, 2020. No, it's just arbitrary dates. I mean, a lot of our immigration stuff, it's just they'd come up with a date and they're like, this is, as of this date, this is what it is. I think, you know, it's a date close to the election. They didn't want to pick the 3rd probably, but they picked that month. I'm imagining it probably has something to do with that. That's when a new, you know, when the election changed the results of, the results of the election. They ended the Muslim ban and a lot of the African bans that we saw that were implemented under the Trump years. It ended, like I said, Trump's enforcement priority, saying that everyone was a priority. They issued a memo saying that everyone is going to be counted for the census. As many of you probably read in the news, that Trump wanted to really exclude immigrants, undocumented immigrants in particular, from being counted. And, you know, they said, no, everyone will be counted. It affirms the DACA protections, and it asks the agency to preserve and fortify DACA. Again, because DACA is in litigation, there is very limited things that Biden could actually do in this moment for DACA. So they're going to have to kind of wait and see how that case plays out. They're, you know, obviously going to be involved in a different posture than the previous administration, which was supporting the end of DACA. They will do the opposite, but you know, there is a case happening, and it ends the wall construction, and it asks the agency to look at how it's going to reallocate the more than $1 billion that were allocated for the wall in this last budget. So in this last budget that was just approved in December, they allocated over $1 billion for the construction of the wall. Congress did that. And so the Biden administration ended that effective immediately, and said, we need to come up with a way to spend that $1 billion in a different way than just building the wall. And then they issued an additional executive order that really asks all of the agencies across the government to look at things from a place of racial equity. And I think that is a significant change, even from the Obama administration and other administrations. And I think this is, you know, as a result of everything that we've seen, all of the actions, all of the showing up, all of that we have seen over the last 4 years, and, you know, even as of the summer, of really looking at immigration through a lens of racial equity, because really that's what it is, and that's how it's been approached unfortunately by the other side, but that is how it's been approached, not as an equitable thing, but as how do we exclude groups of people that we don't want in the country. So this is what has been announced already and has been issued. We're expecting another round of executive orders and announcements about immigration to come on Friday, on the 29th. So we need to keep an eye on that. There's going to be more, I understand, coming out about asylum, about MPP and the folks who are stuck at the border. And so I think we really need to, we're going to have to pay attention to all of those things as they're developing. And again, I think that, it is a new day. I think there is reason for hope. I think there is, I think there's reason for hope, but I think there's still a lot of fighting that we have to do. The one thing I didn't include in here because it's not a thing yet. Well, here. It's actually, let me go into this and then I'll go into the other thing. But the president also sent language to Congress for a bill. Now, I just, want to remind everyone, this is not something the president can just do. And I know the media and different places have been reporting like, President Biden is giving status to 11 million people. And obviously this is something that has to go through Congress. Congress has to change the law in order for this to actually take place. But this bill is really the most progressive immigration bill that I've ever seen introduced by the Democrats. In my experience working in DC and every time is that there's been this internal negotiation first before they even introduce language, and this bill is really, it's a really good bill. Now,
just a little clarification, and people should feel free to pop a question in your chat, or we'll have time for open mic. But this is a bill that's actually in Congress, or is it just language?
It's a bill that was sent to Congress. It hasn't been introduced yet, but it will be introduced by Senator Menendez and by Congresswoman Linda Sanchez from California. So they are introducing this bill. It's called the Citizenship Act of 2021. And and we'll see what happens with it. I think one thing that is, let me just go through this and then I think we can talk about the process, but it does provide a path for legalization for the 11 million people who are undocumented. It gives an access to permanent status, so green cards for people who DACA and TPS. It clears the backlog of family-based immigration. Some people, like I said, have been waiting for 20 or more years to be able to finally immigrate. It would clear that backlog. I think an important piece of this bill, even though it's more symbolic, but words really matter, it changes all of immigration law to get rid of the word alien and to change it to non-citizen. That is something many of us have been, really fighting for. And again, even though that's not a change in the law, it's not a substantive change. It is an important change in how we view immigrant communities and how we talk about them. It eliminates a lot of the barriers that I was talking about that were created in 1996. So it addresses some of those issues. It has more funding for integration and inclusion. It makes getting asylum access to asylum protections more attainable. So there's right now a rule here, and the US is one of the few countries in the world where we have a limitation of only 1 year to apply for asylum after you get here. And that was created in 96 too. So it eliminates that. And then it increases the number of U visas from 10,000 to 30,000 per year. Right now there's a backlog of maybe 8 or more years to wait for a U visa once you qualify. And this would obviously go a long way. So I think what's important about this is
U visas. Yes. U visas are, what are U visas?
U visas are visas for crime victims or crime survivors of certain violent crimes who cooperate with law enforcement.
Right. Holy Trinity out in Fort Huron had somebody from a Sacred Heart in CAPAC that had a U visa, or got a U visa. Because she was abused by her husband,
Right, that's one of the bases. And one of the U visas require people to cooperate with law enforcement in order for them to qualify for it. So it was created as a kind of law enforcement tool to report crimes and prosecute crimes. But it is really, good bill. Now, for many of us who've been doing this work for a long time, we don't feel confident that this bill will become law, especially as it's written. But I think that there may be pieces of this bill that are moved through different mechanisms, or even through this mechanism, that may have some possibilities. Congress, the Senate requires 60 votes in order for most of these bills to become law, which, the Senate is divided right now 50-50, with the vice president being the tie-breaking vote. But we would still need 10 Republicans and all the Democrats to vote for any piece of legislation for it to become law. So I think that that's still a huge challenge for us. There's already been a lot of rumbling on the Republican side, talking about how this is unrealistic, that, we're not doing amnesty and blah, blah, blah. So I think we can expect a lot more of that as this process moves forward. And
you have a couple of questions.
Yes.
Rich and Kathy Faba have a question, and then Ellen Ward. So Rich, Kathy, you want to go ahead and ask?
Yeah, we had heard about the 8-year path to citizenship that was being proposed. Is that the way you're going to
Yes.
allow the undocumented to get in that bill? The 8 years?
Yeah, well, and it's not, yes, that is the path to status for the 11 million is an 8-year path. And like I said, there's going to be, yes, that's the starting point, I think. And I think that's the important piece to remember. And like I said, it's not very likely from what we can tell at this point, or the expectations that are being set, that bill will become law. We haven't passed any favorable immigration laws in probably 30 years in this country. So most of the laws that we have passed have been bad. Anti-immigrant laws, or laws to limit status. But I think that there are possibilities of little pieces coming in and out, coming in and through different ways. So the DREAM Act is something that is more likely to potentially move. There's a typo on my HEROES Act, but the HEROES Act has DACA protection, permanent status for people with DACA and TPS. Under the COVID relief bills, there may be a possibility of getting some protection for folks who are undocumented. There is talk of protections for essential workers, like permanent status for essential workers, especially in the context of the pandemic. And I think obviously another big concern, and probably the number one concern right now for immigrant communities, is access to healthcare and vaccines. Nebraska already said they weren't going to give vaccines to undocumented folks, for example. And obviously that's something that we need the federal government to weigh in on and ensure that people have access not only to vaccines, but to further, access to healthcare for all folks. And so they're different pieces. So I think it's going to be a lot of moving pieces over the next, year for sure, in the next 6 months. And, this is where we go into kind of next steps and what we can do.
Moni, hold on one quick
Yes.
section. Ellen Ward, can you ask your question?
Yeah, just very quickly, how does the current executive orders and legislation pending address undocumented parents who have minors that were born in the U.S. and then who are still currently here? And then secondly, along the same lines, those same parents who have already been deported who have minor U.S. citizen children?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we haven't seen the actual language of the legislation yet, although it's, like I said, it's going to be introduced and they do have language. We only have access to a fact sheet that has the information about the bill. But it does address some folks who were deported, especially people who were deported under the Trump years. So it has a provision that says that if people were deported since 2017 and they lived in the US for 3 years, for at least 3 years before they were deported, there is a possibility that they could come back to the US with a waiver. The bill would address a lot of those things that you're talking about. The executive orders don't necessarily directly address that, except in so much that they don't make folks like that a priority for deportation. So whereas before, before as of last week, so this is all very new, and we're going to have to see how it actually plays out, right? Because even though they're saying these things, we want to make sure this is what's going to actually also happen. But changing the deportation priorities is a big deal, because it'll allow a lot of people to get out of deportation proceedings, to not be prosecuted for deportation proceedings. even if they're still left without status. Ultimately, Congress needs to act, but as we've seen in the last 4 years, and hopefully the Democrats have been paying close attention, there's a lot that the president can do, you know, to make the lives of immigrants better, and immigrant communities better. And it's not all up to Congress, but there's a lot that is up to Congress.
Okay, thank you.
Moni, before you move on there, we've got about 9 minutes left, I think.
Yes.
You're kind of looking to the future here, or kind of
Yes.
some challenge for us, but does anybody have any question about what Moni's already presented before we move into the future? Anybody just unmute and bark it out.
I was wondering how possible it is for Moni and people she works with to have a chance to speak to Senate Republicans and representatives, to show them all this stuff. Do they already know this stuff? Do they need, you know, one-on-one teaching? Is this a good time for lobbyists to get involved, or how does that work? How do you let them know all this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the next steps, since I can talk about it in the context of your question. I think it's a great question. We do try to talk to Republicans, and sometimes they talk to us and sometimes they don't. You know, I think that as we've seen in the last 4 years, there's like, and it's been interesting and I mean, interesting in a kind of theoretical way, but, you know, terrible in that not everyone is looking at the same facts. And there's, you know, and I think that that is something that is a challenge. I think it is really important. Members of Congress want to hear from their own constituents more than they want to hear from people like me or, you know, or whatever. And so I think this is where all of you really make a huge difference. And we are very happy to support those efforts. So we do go to meetings with some of our member organizations that live in states where there are Republican senators, for example. We'll go with them, but we want to make sure that we give you, whoever our member or the organization that we're partnering with, the tools to do the advocacy yourself, right? Because it's going to mean more for the senator if it's coming from their own constituent than if it's coming from someone like me. And so I think this is where the role of organizations and folks like, you know, you don't have to even be a part of an organization, but people who care and people who want to engage is so critical, because you can make a much bigger difference than sometimes I can make. And I can just help support you or whoever it wants to engage in that effort. But those member of Congress meetings are really, really important. And sometimes it's a meeting, and sometimes it's a letter writing campaign, and sometimes it's bombarding their offices with calls, and sometimes it's showing up outside their offices, you know, with signs. And so there's like lots of different ways to escalate the pressure, but definitely starting with a meeting is a really good and important way to make sure they hear the voices of the folks who care about these issues, and that they come kind of with the necessary information and resources to have those meetings.
Moni, I'm just curious about who are the owners of these private detention centers, and who is that money going into their pockets, and how can I don't know how to ask the question other than it makes me angry that you know, that people are making money on different people's suffering.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. So there's a couple of really big corporations. One is called Geo Group. I can send you more information about those, Bill, and if you want to share it with, or if anyone's interested, I have my email at the end of this, and you can email me directly. They're private corporations, so the money is going into the pockets of their investors or their, you know, stockholders and stuff. And one of the things, you know, we often remind folks is, you know, they don't have any names that sound too like, they're not like such and such jail of America or whatever, you know, they're not that kind of names. And so sometimes people, you know, who have investments, for example, in the stock market and mutual funds and things like that, we ask people, like, just make sure you're aware of where your money is going, and, you know, talk to your financial advisors and say, like, hey, I don't want to invest in anything that is funding detention or is growing detention, you know, I want to pull. So we've, through organizing efforts, there's been, for example, banks that have divested from those companies, and others that there's been, you know, there has been some progress around that. Here in Illinois, we actually passed a bill at the state level that prohibits immigration private detention centers private immigration detention centers from operating in the state of Illinois. So there's been those efforts, and the Biden administration did come in with a promise to end private detention. So that's another promise where we're going to have to really push to make sure that we hold them accountable for that, because those lobbyists are very, very powerful, and they have a lot of access to those members of Congress.
Got about 4 minutes left here. Any last questions for Moni? And then, okay, Moni, why don't you wrap it up here a little bit?
Yes.
I have one question.
Yes.
We have 2 senators who are Democrats. Senators. So what's our strategy for them? I'm assuming they're pretty much on board.
Yeah, well, we shouldn't assume that even of any of the Democrats. And, you know, I'm in a state too, I'm in Illinois, so I'm in a state where we have 2 Democratic senators, but we're always pushing them too, because just because they're Democrats doesn't mean they're going to go along with all of this. And so it's really important, just as important as it is as having those meetings with the Republicans, it's important to have the meetings with the Democrats too. You know, we've had previous control by the Democrats, both in the House, the Senate, and the White House under Obama, and we didn't see any positive movement on immigration. So this is, you know, I always tell people that keeping folks undocumented has been a truly bipartisan effort, and that even when people have had control, they haven't really used that to the benefit of our immigrant community. And so it's really critical to push everybody. It's not just the Republicans that are the problem, and to do it consistently, right? It's not just to do it one time and then never show up again. So I think that, you know, I want to make sure people know that it's really, really important to show up for immigrant communities. I know all of you were already doing a lot of that work in your circles and in all of the work that you're doing with Strangers No Longer and other spaces in your churches. I think it's really important to have these conversations with members of Congress, to have, you know, to look at state level stuff too, because the local and state policies are really important as well. And there's a lot of things that can be done locally and at the state level.
Moni,
yes.
Just say a word about getting those friendly immigrant things in your little suburb or your little town.
Yeah. So.
And by the way, people should on the private prisons, Joel Wheeler's been putting up a couple of websites, so you might check your chat box. Moni, go ahead.
Yes. So, you know, for us, one of the things in my previous work that I was doing is working on local ordinances and local and state and local work. And it is so important to build that support in your community. You know, you start with your immediate community, your churches, your neighborhood, and then, you know, you can build up that way, right? And that builds up to the higher, you know, to the federal or whatever. But we were able to work locally in lots of little suburban locations here around Chicago. Actually, we passed 8 welcoming ordinances, and we're happy to share language or strategies or whatever it is if you guys are interested in doing that. But in really talking to your local, you know, whatever they are, members, you know, city councils or trustees or whatever you call them in your own districts, and getting them to understand why it's important. Not only, and I think it's going to be even important right now in these times, even though we're seeing better things at the federal level, but for people to be bold and take a position to say, we welcome immigrants. And it's not enough to just say it. We need people to do stuff to show it, right? So it's okay. You don't want people to just say, like, pass something symbolic that says we welcome immigrants, we want them here in our communities, or, you know, everyone's welcome. But it's really looking at your own policies and practices, right? How does your local police department work with immigration? Or, you know, do you have a policy that requires that ensures that your employees of your village or your town will not ask anyone about their place of birth, because that is shouldn't be relevant for any kind of, you know, local purpose. Things like that will make sure that people feel welcome, right? And that will make sure that they are sending a message that they are going to take the steps necessary to protect immigrant communities in your own neighborhood, in your own town. And I think that is going to go a long way. We were able to do that in a number of places in Illinois. Some of them not all, you know, Illinois always has this reputation for being super blue, and it tends to be definitely in Cook County and the Chicago area. But once you get out of there, the rest of the state's pretty red. And we were able to pass some, you know, pretty significant ordinances in local jurisdictions involving churches, involving local folks, people from schools, and who could come and speak at city council meetings and say, this is why it's important to me, this is why we should pass it. And we were able to help support them with kind of all the tools that they needed. I think there's maybe one.
Moni,
Oh,
we're
this-
gonna
this- yeah,
we're gonna have to end now,
yes,
and we'll bring you back another time.
of course, anytime.
Of course, Michigan now, the sun is shining and it's probably about 70 degrees out there. So if you ever feel like coming to Michigan,
I love Michigan.
I'll let Martha, I'm gonna pass it back now to Sister Martha Cook or Sister Martha de la Torre, and she can do the thank yous and everything else. Sister Martha.
Okay. Well, we want to thank you all for joining us in this workshop, and of course to thank you, Moni, that for your support in sharing all these elements that they are really very valuable for our commitment to the immigrant cause, and they will help us to look at the future. Thank you very much all, and thank you, Moni, again.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay.
Gracias.